picture yourself stumbling through a midnight market in Thebes, where the incense is thick, drums echo like a heartbeat, and suddenly the music screeches to a halt, like someone pulled the plug on a party you didn't even know you were invited to. Hey folks, before we unspool this mystery, smash that like button if you love a good ancient cliffhanger, and drop a comment with your favorite cursed mummy meme. Now dim the lights, snag a comfy pillow, maybe even a cup of tea that smells like sand and citrus, because we're about to walk into the quiet after the feast. You feel the cool stone under your sandals, hear the distant hiss of the Nile's night wind, and wonder why the once loud festivals faded like fresco paint in a desert storm. Turns out, the gods weren't angry. It was paperwork, taxes, political shuffles, and a plague that reeked of rotten figs, forcing the priests to swap drumsticks for scrolls. And frankly, that's as anticlimactic as my Wi-Fi dropping during a TikTok binge. So, what do you think killed the celebrations? Politics, disease, or plain old party fatigue? Let me know below. And stay tuned as we peel back centuries of sand to find the truth. The sun rose over Thebes, casting a soft amber on the limestone walls as market stalls opened with the clatter of pottery and the scent of figs. High Priestess Nephrit adjusted the linen band of her headdress, while the Vizier Kem inspected the polished barges waiting at the dock. Musicians tuned their lyres beside the riverbank, their strings humming in a low, steady rhythm that matched the distant murmur of the Nile. Children traced circles in the sand, their bare feet brushing cool grains that glittered like tiny mica. The city's streets, lined with palm fronds, filled with the rustle of fabric as citizens gathered for the Opet festival, each step measured and purposeful. In the quiet corners, elders whispered stories of past celebrations, their voices a gentle backdrop to the growing anticipation. As the day warmed, a thin ribbon of dust rose from the dried riverbank, catching the light in a mute, golden veil. A hushed murmur spread through the crowd when a water carrier returned with a half-filled jar, its contents clinging to the sides like reluctant memory. Kem paused by the quay, his fingertips feeling the rough rope of the barge, noting the faint tremor in the wood. Nephrit's eyes lingered on the low horizon, where the waterline seemed to recede a little further than the year before. The chanting of the choir, once bright, lowered to a softer timbre, as if the chorus sensed the uneasy shift in the air. Yet the lanterns, already lit, cast a steady glow that barely disturbed the growing tension. Even as the officials proceeded with the procession, the dry air pressed against the skin of the participants like a quiet admonition. The dancers, their sandals thudding on stone, moved with the same practiced grace, though the mud under their feet felt cracked and unyielding. A merchant offered dates, the sticky fruit sticking to palms, while a vendor's jar of barley sang a faint crackle when shaken, underscoring the irony of abundance in a waning season. The high priestess lifted a ceremonial cup, its gilded rim catching the late day sun, but the water inside swirled thinly, barely reaching the base. Laughter lingered, thin and polite, as the crowd continued, aware of the discrepancy between ritual and reality. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in muted ochre, while the river's surface reflected a calm that seemed to ignore the earlier unease. The crowd settled onto stone benches, their backs resting against cool columns, and the soft rustle of scrolls being read filled the silence. Kem removed his sandals, feeling the temperature shift as the stone released the day's heat into his feet. Nefret sipped a modest draught of water, its chill traveling through her throat, and she let her gaze linger on the distant fields, now tinged with the faint scent of wilted barley. Around them, the musicians lowered their instruments, their final notes lingering like a gentle sigh across the plaza. In the aftermath, the city's rhythm returned to its ordinary cadence, the festive fanfare giving way to the predictable hum of daily chores. When the next season's flood failed to arrive, the council convened beneath the same colonnade, their discussions measured and quiet, noting that the oppet rites could no longer be performed as before. The people, accustomed to the pattern of celebration, adjusted their calendars, finding comfort in the simple act of sharing bread at dusk rather than in grand procession. Nefret, now older, taught the children to trace the river's outline on clay tablets, preserving the memory of water that had once surged with confidence. Kem oversaw the repair of the irrigation channels, his hands feeling the earth's grit, accepting that human effort must fill the gaps left by nature. In the gentle hush that settled over Thebes, the city learned that reverence could reside not in spectacle, but in the steady, unhurried breath of ordinary lives. In the cool pre-dawn light, the stone steps of the great temple were still wet from the night's dew, and the bronze bells that once rang above the courtyard lay silent, their clappers motionless, as if holding their breath. Kem, the scribe, stepped forward with a folded papyrus that smelled of reeds and ink, delivering a royal decree that ordered the suspension of all public celebrations until the gods would make their will known. The decree rested on a small altar where a scarab amulet, once glinting green with lapis, now lay shattered into shards that reflected the weak sun like broken glass. The priestess, her face veiled in the shadow of the column, lifted a finger to the broken piece and asked quietly what omen it might bear. Around them, the staff of the temple shuffled, their linen robes rustling faintly, As the first murmurs of uncertainty began to stir inside the inner sanctum, the council of priests gathered around low stone benches, their palms warm from the incense smoke that curled lazily in the air. They examined the scarab fragments with deliberate, almost hesitant touches, noting the chipped edges that seemed to echo the sudden hush that had fallen over the city. Voices, low and measured, debated whether the break was a sign of divine displeasure or simply the result of an unnoticed hand slipping during the night's cleaning. Kem, his fingers tracing the papyrus, listened as the older priest, his beard catching a faint glint of light, suggested that perhaps the gods were testing the patience of their followers. Outside, the market stalls remained orderly, the scent of dates and barley mingling with the quiet, as the townspeople waited for a clear word that never arrived. A thin smile appeared on the youngest priest's lips as he gently lifted a fragment and placed it beside a bowl of figs, noting with a faint chuckle that the scarab now seemed more a decorative coaster than a sacred token. The irony, unspoken yet palpable, lay in the fact that the broken amulet still attracted the same reverent glances that the whole celebration once commanded, as if the people were more attached to the ritual of looking than to the ritual itself. The priestess, her eyes hidden behind the dimly lit arch, whispered that perhaps the gods appreciated a good joke, though her words dissolved into the soft rustle of papyrus. Kem recorded the exchange, feeling the cool stone beneath his sandals and the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat echoing the lingering stillness. The council, now slightly loosened by the subtle humor, returned the shards to a wooden box, sealing them like a memory that would not be spoken aloud. As the sun climbed higher, the decree's weight settled over the city like a warm blanket, and people returned to their everyday motions. Potters turning wheels, women grinding wheat, children tracing patterns in the sand. The temple courtyard, once a place of loud drumming and laughter, became a space where the wind whispered through the columns, carrying the faint scent of lotus and cedar. Priests resumed their quieter duties, cleaning the altar, polishing the statues, while the broken scarab lingered in a drawer, a reminder that some ceremonies could be paused without breaking the fabric of daily life. Kem, now seated at his desk, felt the smooth grain of his wooden chair against his back as he copied the decree into the archive, the ink drying slowly under the golden light. The city's pulse continued, steady and unhurried, as if the absence of celebration had simply opened a space for contemplation. When years later a traveler would glance at the temple's stone walls, they would notice the faint indentation where the scarab had once rested, a subtle imprint of history's pause. The quiet that settled over the streets lingered in the collective memory. teaching that even the grandest festivities can be set aside without losing the thread of community. The priests, whose faces remained forever blurred by torchlight, left behind a lesson in restraint, captured in the soft sigh of reeds and the lingering taste of tea at dusk. Kem's hand, now old and trembling, traced the faded edges of the decree, feeling the weight of ink and the lightness of a moment when humanity chose stillness over spectacle. In the end, the story rested like a gently closed book, its pages turning slowly in the mind of anyone who dared to listen to the quiet between the notes. The great procession that once thundered through Thebes now moves like a muted tide, its linen banners brushing the stone steps without a drumbeat. Sunlight glints off the polished copper of the sun chariots, yet the air carries only the soft shuffle of sandals. Nefret, a young scribe with ink-stained fingers, watches the line of priests whose faces are hidden in the glare of the midday sun. The crowd, accustomed to the clamor of cymbals, leans forward as if waiting for a sound that will not come. Even the walls of the mortuary seem to exhale a slower rhythm, as if the city itself has been asked to hold its breath. Along the banks, the Nile's waterline has slipped back, exposing mud that smells of wet earth and forgotten reeds. Fishermen pull their nets from a river that feels thinner, their hands trembling against the cold, slick rope. Market stalls whisper of lost catch. A vendor smooths his linen cloth, eyes darting to the receding tide. Children, who normally chase the splash of waves, stand in a thin line, fingers clenched around broken reeds. A low murmur spreads through the crowd, a mixture of curiosity and unease that settles like dust on the granite pillars. The silence feels heavier now, pressing against the stone arches that have heard louder prayers. Nefret finds herself before the priest of Happy, whose silhouette is blurred by the glare of a lantern, his eyes hidden like polished obsidian. She asks why the river god is being ignored, and the priest's voice folds into the rustle of papyrus scrolls. He replies that the pharaoh, in his wisdom, ordered a pause so the waters would not be provoked, a decision that sounds both prudent and absurd to the listening crowd. The irony hangs in the air like a thin veil, a god of abundance silenced by a ruler fearing excess. Around them, merchants exchange quiet glances, their carts idling as if waiting for a cue that has yet to arrive. The scene feels like a paused film, the frame held still while the story waits for the next reel. Word of the pharaoh's decree spreads slowly, carried on the breath of sand and the soft clack of wooden sandals. People begin to adjust their chores, measuring water in shallow basins and timing their irrigation by the shade of palm fronds. Even the temple's incense burns lower, releasing a gentle amber haze that mingles with the evening breeze. Nefrit watches the city settle into a quieter rhythm, the once boisterous crowds now moving like a tide that has learned to linger. In the courtyard, an elderly woman knits beside a quiet well, her fingers slipping through yarn as the river's edge recedes further. The stillness settles like a soft blanket, and the city breathes in a measured, patient cadence. Later, as twilight paints the walls in muted ochre, the people sit beside the narrowing Nile, their thoughts drifting like slow moving boats. They recall the echo of drums that once defined their days, now replaced by the rustle of papyrus and the occasional sigh of wind. Nefrit writes in her ledger, noting that the river's retreat taught them to listen more closely to the gaps between sounds. The pharaoh's cautious pause becomes a quiet lesson. Power is as fragile as the water that slips through one's fingers. In the hush, the city finds a modest comfort, understanding that silence can hold as much meaning as a chorus. They close the day with a shared sigh, a collective acknowledgement that even the grandest celebrations may rest, allowing humanity to simply be. The sky over Thebes opened like a cracked parchment, spilling a slow rain of bright stones that fell in quiet succession. Farmers leaned against the cool mud of their fields, feeling the faint vibration of each impact on the earth beneath their sandals. Women carrying baskets of barley paused, their eyes tracing the luminous arcs that vanished beyond the horizon. The air held a subtle chill, and the distant murmur of the Nile seemed to hold its breath, as if listening to the heavens. In the palace courtyard, the stone lions and the blurred silhouettes of priests watched the spectacle with a measured stillness, their faces hidden in the soft glow of torchlight. By the next morning, the market stalls were filled with hushed conversations about the night's omen, the words slipping like sand through clenched fists. Nefrit, a scribe whose hands were accustomed to the steady scratch of reed pens, noticed a faint metallic taste in the water drawn from the Nile's source near the western marshes. She traced the source to a small, concealed inlet where a stranger's bundle of reeds lay half submerged, exuding a faint, sour odor. The sound of distant drums grew louder, echoing the growing unease among the city's guards. In the shade of the palace colonnade, the blurred outline of a high priest whispered warnings that barely rose above the rustle of papyrus scrolls. When Nefrit presented her findings to the pharaoh, the ruler's furrowed brow reflected the dim light of oil lamps. Yet his voice remained as steady as the desert wind. The rival city-state of Osiris had sent a delegation under the pretense of trade, their hidden agenda masked by generous gifts of linen and figs. Ironically, the very celebration that had brought joy to the people now risked being the conduit for their downfall. As the poisoned inlet threatened the river that fed every field and home, the pharaoh weighed the cost of a swift retaliation against the subtle weight of a renewed, solemn ceremony designed to appease the unseen gods. He chose to pause the war drums, opting instead for a quiet procession that would carry the scent of incense along the riverbanks, a gesture both humble and deliberate. The night of the renewed ceremony unfolded beneath a sky now clear and amber, the earlier meteor shower leaving only faint embers in memory. Citizens gathered along the river's edge, their feet sinking softly into the damp sand as they offered small bowls of water to the flow, each ripple catching the flicker of oil-lit lanterns. Musicians played low, steady chords on lyres, their strings vibrating with a restrained melancholy that matched the steady heartbeat of the crowd. The pharaoh walked slowly, his robe brushing the cool stone steps, his face concealed by the shadow of his headdress, while the priests performed silent gestures that seemed to echo the earlier meteoric lights. The atmosphere remained calm, a gentle reminder that reverence could be expressed without grand spectacle. In the months that followed, the Nile ran clear, and the memory of the poisoned inlet faded into the background of everyday chores and the soft clatter of pottery wheels. Nefret recorded the episode in a thin papyrus, noting how a fleeting celestial event had prompted a pause that saved an entire civilization from a silent threat. The people continued to celebrate, but with a softer rhythm, their laughter now tempered by an awareness of how quickly peace could be unsettled. The blurred faces of the priesthood and the unseen gods lingered only as faint impressions, reminders that humanity's actions, however small, shape the currents of history. As night fell each evening, the quiet rustle of reeds and the distant call of a nightjar became a comforting lullaby, sealing the lesson that even in stillness, vigilance endures. In the early days of the Third Dynasty, the city of Thebes hummed with the low clang of bronze cymbals and the soft murmur of crowds gathering by the riverbank. Traders laid out baskets of figs and barley, their hands dusted with golden dust from the sand, while scribes etched the day's dates onto limestone tablets. Yet a thin veil of silence fell one season, as the newly crowned pharaoh, his crown heavy with the weight of unseen expectation, ordered a sudden halt to the annual festival of the flood. The edicts were posted on stone pillars, the ink dark as night, and the people felt the quiet settle like a thin layer of mud on the shore. Children, who had earlier chased each other's shadows under the papyrus awnings, paused, watching the sun reflect oddly off still water. Weeks passed, and the river's swell seemed to mute itself, the usual chorus of reed boats and laughing women replaced by the distant sigh of wind through mud-brick walls. Market stalls remained half-filled. The scent of roasted duck lingered without the usual laughter that would have followed. The silence grew palpable, as if the very stone of the temples were holding its breath, and a faint ache settled in the backs of the laborers hauling limestone blocks. Even the unseen face of the high priest, always hidden in shadow, seemed to linger longer in the dim corridors, his footsteps echoing in a corridor that no longer rang with song. The people, accustomed to rhythm, found themselves counting the slow pulse of time in the cooling evenings. When the pharaoh finally lifted the ban, it was not with a thunderous proclamation, but with a gentle rustle of papyrus, a modest decree that invited a new rite of gratitude rather than exuberant revelry. The ceremony called for quiet offerings of dates placed in shallow bowls, their skins glistening with dew, and an hour of reflective silence as the sun slipped toward the horizon. Workers, still dusty from their day's toil, placed their hands on the cool stone of the quay, feeling the faint tremor of the Nile's renewed flow beneath. The irony lingered, celebrations returned, yet they were now tempered by the memory of a season without music, the echo of a pause that taught the city the value of its own breath. A soft chuckle could be heard among the elders, as if the ancient gods themselves smiled behind a veil of twilight. As the Nile swelled once more, the city's rhythm resumed, but with a quieter cadence. Musicians tuned their lyres at a lower pitch, the notes lingering like warm breath on cold stone, while dancers moved with measured steps, their sandals whispering against the sand. Families gathered under wide-brimmed hats, sharing figs and flatbread, the taste of sweet honey lingering on their tongues as they watched the water glitter in amber light. The atmosphere held a gentle steadiness, the kind that settles after a long night, where each heartbeat seems to echo softly against the walls of the great halls. Even the unseen priest, his face forever hidden by the glow of incense, bowed his head slightly as he observed the renewed, yet softened, celebration. In the years that followed, the memory of the silence became a quiet thread woven into the fabric of daily life, a reminder that joy, when taken for granted, can slip away like water through a reed. Children grew up hearing the story of the halted festival, their grandparents' voices low but steady, as they traced the river's edge with bare feet, feeling the cool grains of sand sift between their toes. The city learned to measure its festivals not only in loud applause, but also in the still moments between drums, where gratitude settled like dust on a shelf. The pharaoh's decree, once a pause, transformed into a gentle cadence that shaped future generations, ensuring that celebrations would always be balanced with reverent quiet. Thus the ancient rhythms persisted, forever echoing the soft, patient hum of a civilization that learned to listen to its own heartbeats. In the pale dawn that brushed the limestone walls of Thebes, priestess Nepheret arranged bundles of lotus reeds by the temple courtyard. Beside her, scribe Chem unrolled papyrus scrolls, his reed pen scratching the rhythm of the upcoming Apit festival. The sound of water lapping against the dock mixed with the low murmur of laborers hauling painted bark for the processional bark. Sunlight warmed the sand as market stalls unfurled blue-gray linens, and the scent of fresh barley bread drifted through the air. Everyone moved with a measured patience, aware that the river would soon carry the honored statue to the king's mortuary temple. Yet, even as their hands steadied the ritual's details, a faint ripple of anticipation rose from the crowd, an unspoken promise that this year would be remembered. By mid-morning, a caravan of Nubian traders set camp near the western quay, unloading jars of dark honey and unfamiliar drums, whose beats rattled the stone columns. Chem watched the strangers' bright textiles flutter in the wind, noting how their patterns clashed with the familiar ochre of Egyptian linen. Whispers threaded through the workers. Some wondered whether the foreign songs might disturb the ceremonial order that the priests had guarded for generations. Nepheret felt a subtle tightening in her shoulders as a child chased a spilled lotus petal across the sand. Its bright green, a small discord against the beige ceremony. The river's current grew a shade murkier, and the boatwrights paused, uneasy about the sudden change in water's temperature. Still, the preparations continued, each knot tied with a careful breath that masked the undercurrent of unease. As the sun climbed, a sudden gust sent a skein of papyrus ribbons dancing across the courtyard, tangling the scribe's ink pot and spilling black marks onto the freshly painted mural. Nepheret laughed softly, the sound catching on the marble, while a young apprentice tripped over a wayward offering basket, scattering dates onto the sand like tiny amber pearls. The grand bark, meant to glide majestically, found its prow snagged on a wayward reed, forcing a brief, clumsy pull that made the overseers exchange amused glances. Even the priests, whose faces remained hidden in the morning light, seemed to smile behind the veil of incense, as the ceremony's solemnity was punctuated by these modest mishaps. The market vendors, oblivious to the delays, offered fresh figs to anyone who paused, turning the tension into a quiet exchange of simple generosity. In that moment, the solemnity of the festival felt both grand and absurd, as if the universe had set a gentle reminder that perfection often rests on crooked steps. By late afternoon, the river's surface settled into a smooth amber sheen, and the bark finally slipped free, its golden hull catching the fading light as it drifted toward the mortuary temple. The gathered crowd formed a thin line along the banks, their shadows long and still, while the distant chant of a flute blended with the soft splash of oars. Neferet stood at the temple entrance, her robe brushed by a cool breeze, watching the concealed faces of the deities reflected in the water's mirror. Kem recorded the rhythm of the procession on his scroll, each stroke a quiet echo of the community's collective heartbeat. Children sat on the sand, their feet splayed, watching the boats with patient eyes, while elders exchanged stories in low tones that rose like smoke from the incense burners. The day eased into a gentle hush, the ceremony concluding with a simple offering of barley cake that melted into the night's calm. As the torches dimmed and the river's edge emptied, the workers returned to their huts, carrying the lingering scent of reeds and the faint echo of drums that had once seemed foreign. Neferet folded the remaining lotus leaves, noting how the small disruptions had become part of the festival's memory, a quiet testament to change woven into tradition. Kem placed his completed scroll on a shelf, the ink slightly smudged, yet the record remained a steady line that future scribes could read without haste. The community's laughter that evening was tempered, like the soft rustle of papyrus, acknowledging that the grand rituals survived not by rigid perfection, but by patient adaptation. In the cool night, the river whispered its timeless song, reminding those who listened that every celebration is simultaneously a beginning and an ending, each ripple carrying both hope and the quiet acceptance of decline. The story of that Opet day settled into the collective memory, a gentle cadence that would guide generations to observe, endure, and smile at the subtle irony of human endeavor. When the first lanterns were hoisted along the riverbank, the air carried the faint scent of papyrus and the distant murmur of workers polishing stone steely. Neferet, the overseer of the upcoming festival, walked the length of the quay, feeling the warm sand press against the soles of her sandals. The river reflected the pale amber of the sunrise, and the crowd's low chatter settled like a gentle ripple. Children traced lazy patterns in the mud, while artisans arranged bundles of reeds for the ceremonial processions. The day began with a measured rhythm, as if the Nile itself were holding its breath for the celebration to come. By mid-morning, the incense burners lay cold, their charcoal unlit, and the expected perfume of frankincense failed to rise, leaving a thin, dry scent of dust in the breezy heat. A sudden dry wind brushed the riverbanks, coaxing the water level down a few inches, and the fishermen's nets hung limp, their ropes humming faintly in the stillness. Whispers grew louder among the market stalls, carrying rumors of a new cult that promised rain in exchange for abandoning the old rites. Neferet felt the weight of the unlit braziers against her shoulders and heard the distant clatter of pots, as if time were rearranging its own cadence. The ordinary signs of a day gone awry stitched together a quiet unease that settled over the preparations. Into this subdued atmosphere arrived Seti, a charismatic outsider whose voice carried the smooth timbre of someone used to speaking before crowds. Yet his face remained blurred by the shade of his wide-brimmed hat. He argued that the ancient rituals had become heavy chains, draining the kingdom's vitality, and suggested that a simpler, more pragmatic ceremony might restore the Nile's generosity. The irony lay in his polished sandals, which reflected the sun like polished stone, while the very people he addressed clutched the same weathered tools they had used for generations. Neferet watched the exchange from the side. The soft rustle of her linen robe a quiet counterpoint to the rising murmur of dissent. The crowd's reaction was a measured nod here, a hesitant frown there, the whole scene unfolding with the calm inevitability of a slow tide. As the sun tilted toward the western horizon, the heat softened and a gentle coolness settled over the river, coaxing the water to glisten like glass. Neferet, after a long pause, ordered the incense to be reheated, and a modest plume of scented smoke finally rose, curling lazily above the bronze statues. The market vendors resumed their rhythmic bargaining, the clink of copper pots returning to a familiar cadence, while Seti quietly retreated to the shade, his presence fading like a passing cloud. Children resumed their games, their laughter a soft percussion against the backdrop of lapping water. The day moved forward, each small adjustment a reminder that traditions could bend without breaking, and the audience settled into a shared, unhurried breath. When night finally draped its dark veil over the Nile, the lanterns glowed like distant constellations, and Neferet stood at the edge of the quay, feeling the cool night air brush against her cheeks. She reflected on the day's subtle shifts, recognizing that the festival's heart was not the incense alone, but the steady hands that tended the river, and the quiet conversations spoken under shadowed arches. The blurred silhouettes of priests and citizens alike seemed to merge into a single, unassuming line along the water's edge, each figure a testament to perseverance. In the soft hush, the river whispered its timeless song, reminding her that history moves not in grand eruptions, but in the patient accumulation of ordinary moments. With a gentle sigh, she turned away, letting the calm of the evening settle into memory, a quiet lesson in humility and continuity. At the heart of Thebes, the city's streets swelled with the scent of incense and the low murmur of drums as artisans arranged bright linens for the upcoming festivals. The high priestess moved among the tables, her hands steady as she inspected freshly woven garb, while the river's cool breath brushed against the stone steps. Kem, a low-ranking scribe, recorded the procession of gilded statues and the clatter of copper bracelets on stone, noting each detail with a practiced calm. Children chased the shadows of lanterns, their laughter echoing against the brick walls in a rhythm that matched the distant chant of a choir. The evening air grew warm, the sun slipping behind dunes, and the city settled into a patient anticipation of the days to come. When the priestess fell ill, a hush settled over the marble courtyards, the incense smoke suddenly feeling heavier than usual. Courtiers gathered in the cool shade of colonnades, their voices low as they weighed the cost of lavish feasts against the dwindling supplies of dates and barley. A scribe's quill scratched a terse report, while a steward's fingers brushed the rough surface of a wooden ledger, each motion hinting at the gravity of abandoning tradition. The royal council's debate rose and fell like the tide. The clink of ceremonial cups punctuating moments of reluctant agreement. Even the river seemed to pause, its surface stilling, as if listening to the uncertainty that rippled through the stone arches. Kem, lingering by the temple's archive, discovered a set of weathered tablets that hinted the festivals once aligned with a star that now drifted beyond the horizon's reach. He traced the faint glyphs with a fingertip, feeling the cool grit of sand trapped in the stone, and realized the celestial cycle had slipped, leaving the rituals out of step with the night sky. The irony of spending gold on celebrations that no longer echoed the heavens was not lost on him, though his voice remained soft as the rustle of papyrus. He shared the finding with a weary steward, who merely shrugged, the faint smile on his face as tired as the worn sandals on his feet. The courtyard lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to mock the effort of preserving a tradition no longer in sync with the cosmos. A quiet decision settled over the palace. The festivals would be paused, their elaborate banners rolled away and stored in cool chambers. The night fell gently, the cool limestone walls absorbing the faint crackle of firewood as workers cleaned the empty plazas. People returned to their modest homes, the scent of figs and flatbread filling modest rooms where families ate in soft, unhurried conversation. The river's steady murmur continued, indifferent yet comforting, as if reassuring the city that life would flow regardless of ceremony. Even the high priestess, though still frail, smiled faintly when a child offered her a reed pen, a simple gesture that felt steadier than any procession. Weeks later, Kem walked along the riverbank, the sand slipping through his sandals as he reflected on the fleeting nature of grand displays. He watched the water catch the amber glow of the setting sun, noting how the light softened the once sharp outlines of stone statues now draped in plain cloth. The realization settled within him like dust on an old manuscript. Human effort is often measured not by the splendor of the act, but by the quiet acceptance of change. The city's pulse resumed its ordinary rhythm, the distant echo of drums replaced by the rustle of palm leaves in a gentle breeze. In that stillness, Kem felt a quiet reverence for the imperfect continuity of everyday life. The day began with the low hum of the city of Thebes, where the scent of wheat and river mud mingled with the distant clatter of market stalls. Sunlight filtered through the thin papyrus curtains of the palace, casting a warm amber on the stone steps where officials checked the ceremonial tablets. People gathered along the Nile's banks, their linen robes rustling as they waited for the Opet procession to commence. The sky was clear, a deep blue that promised a rare solar eclipse the priests had marked on the calendar for generations. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, eyes bright with curiosity, while the hidden faces of the priests lingered in the shade of the altar, their expressions blurred by the bright light. The eclipse arrived like a sigh, the sun shrinking behind a moving shadow that turned day into a soft twilight. As the crowd inhaled the cooler air, a sudden wind gathered, lifting dust from the riverbank and stirring the surface of the water into ripples. The ceremonial flame, which had burned steadily for hours, sputtered and was snuffed out by the unexpected gust, leaving a faint wisp of smoke that vanished into the dimming sky. The Nile, swollen by recent rains, surged higher against its embankments, its rush audible over the murmurs of the assembled citizens. Neferet, the overseer of the rite, felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders, the hidden gaze of the high priest hovering unseen behind the darkened altar. The extinguished light forced the participants to confront a tradition that had long been relegated to the margins of official record, a rite whispered about, but never performed openly. Neferet consulted the faded inscriptions that spoke of a forbidden offering, a gesture that promised to summon balance, yet demanded a personal sacrifice that few would accept. The irony lay in the fact that the very ceremony designed to sustain the kingdom now required its steward to risk the very stability it protected. She touched the cool stone of the altar, feeling the rough texture of centuries of use, and sensed the paradox of seeking order through an act that could invite chaos. Around her, The crowd waited in a hush, their faces soft and unfocused, as if the unseen faces of ancestors watched from the shadows. Choosing to proceed, Neferet lifted the ceremonial water jar, its clay still warm from the sun, and poured a measured stream onto the ash-covered altar, an act that felt both ordinary and profound. The quiet ripple of the liquid echoed faintly against the distant surge of the river, creating a rhythm that steadied the breath of those present. As the forbidden rite unfolded, the wind softened, the clouds drifted apart, and a thin sliver of light returned, casting a gentle glow on the faces that remained indistinct in the dim. The procession resumed at a slower pace, each footstep deliberate, the sound of sandals on stone punctuating the stillness. In the background, the river's edge settled, its surface reflecting the emerging sun in a calm, amber mirror. When the day finally waned, the people dispersed slowly, their movements echoing the measured cadence of the earlier ceremony. And Neferet lingered by the river, feeling the cool moisture of the banks on her fingertips. The eclipse had passed, leaving behind a faint memory of darkness that would be recorded in the annals, not as a failure, but as a reminder of the fragile balance between ritual and reality. Scholars later noted the subtle shift in the festival's tone, observing that the community's willingness to adapt had softened the edge of tradition without erasing its core. The hidden priesthood, though never seen, seemed to smile behind the veil of shadow, content that the kingdom survived the momentary lapse. In the quiet of the evening, the city settled into a soft amber hush, the lingering scent of incense and river water mingling with the distant croak of frogs, a gentle testament to human endurance. When the Nile finally pulled back to its familiar banks, the last tremor of the flood lingered in the cool mud beneath the workers' feet, and the market square filled with the soft shuffle of sandals on packed earth. Children gathered near the cracked stone platform, where once candles had flickered for the festival of the sun, their eyes dimmed by the waning light of an overcast sky. Traders laid out baskets of dates and figs, their scents mingling with the distant scent of reeds drying in the sun. A low murmur rose as elders recalled the bright chants that used to echo from the temple walls, now reduced to a quiet sigh. The air held a gentle stillness, as if the city itself were listening for a rhythm that had already slipped away. That evening, a sudden eclipse darkened the river, and a hushed breath swept through the crowds, the sudden chill brushing against shoulders still warm from the day's labor. The eclipse was read by the blurred silhouettes of priests, their faces hidden in shadow as a warning to adapt. Yet the people felt an unsettling tug between reverence and uncertainty. Market stalls faltered, the clink of copper coins softened, and the usual chatter turned to tentative whispers about what the omen meant for the waning rites. Hands that once lifted incense now gripped the rope of their carts tighter, feeling the weight of tradition slipping through their fingers. The tension lingered like the faint afterglow of the eclipse, a reminder that the old songs were fading, while new verses struggled to find a voice. In the days that followed, attempts to resurrect the lost ceremonies produced a quiet comedy of errors. A procession of dancers in worn linen stumbled over cracked steps, their footfalls echoing off walls that no longer resonated with drums. The leading figure, a prophet whose face was forever concealed by the glare of sunrise, gestured toward an unfinished altar, his hands trembling like reeds in a gentle wind. The crowd watched the mishap with a collective, sleepy smile, aware that devotion could be both solemn and absurd. Laughter, thin as a desert breeze, rose as a baker offered stale bread to the absent gods, the crumbly texture of the loaf reflecting the fragile state of belief. The irony lay in the tenderness with which they clung to gestures that no longer held the power they once imagined. A soft humor that steadied the pulse of the community. Amid this quiet turmoil, Neferet, a name now spoken with a respectful hush, sat by the riverbank, her fingertips tracing the patterns of water as she wrote a new hybrid rite onto parchment. The script blended the old symbols with freshly drawn motifs of trade and daily labor, honoring the ancient deities while inviting the world of merchants and farmers into the fold. The sound of her quill scratching was a gentle rhythm, matching the slow lap of the river against the stone, and the ink's warm amber hue caught the fading light. As she recorded the verses, nearby villagers paused their work, feeling the subtle shift from ritual to remembrance. The modest ceremony of sharing simple food becoming a living archive. The calm that settled over the settlement resembled twilight, a soft blanket that let the past rest without demanding its full return. When the last line of Neferet's scroll was completed, the community gathered beneath the open sky, the stars emerging like quiet witnesses to a story that would now be told in whispers and modest gatherings. The fragrance of warm wheat dough rose from a communal oven, mingling with the faint perfume of lotus blossoms, while elderly hands passed down the newly penned verses to younger ears. In the hush, the blurred faces of the unseen prophets seemed to smile from the periphery, content that memory had found a new vessel. The night settled into a gentle rhythm of shared breaths, the river's steady hum echoing the steady beat of the people's hearts. In that moment, the lost festivals lived not as grand spectacles, but as quiet threads woven into the fabric of everyday life, a testament to endurance and gentle adaptation. The sun rose over Thebes as Pharaoh Akhenaten walked the palace corridor, his sandals quiet on the cool stone. Whispered reports drifted in from the desert provinces, where rival nomarchs were sharpening their spears and sharpening their words. In the temple of Amun, incense curled lazily, while the priests sensed a subtle chill, as if the familiar echo of their chants were being nudged aside. The young vizier Neferet, his sleeves dusted with sand, laid out a scroll of reforms on a low table, his fingers tracing the ink with deliberate calm. Around the marble pillars, courtiers and scribes watched the parchment unfurl, aware that the first seeds of uncertainty were being planted with the same steady hand that measured grains of barley. By midday, the courtyard filled with the clatter of carts and the low murmur of officials debating the new decrees, each voice carrying the weight of a distant fief. The priests of Amun gathered behind the thick curtains, their chants hushed, while the high priest's hand twitched over a hidden altar, the bronze sun disk catching a stray beam. Nomarchs from the north arrived on dusty steeds, their banners fluttering like restless birds, and the air grew thick with the scent of spiced figs and unspoken challenges. Neferet's reforms, meant to streamline tribute, now tangled the ledger pages, causing scribes to pause and stare at the numbers as if they were unfamiliar hieroglyphs. The tension lingered like a warm breeze that refused to settle, leaving the stone floors warm underfoot, but the hearts of the temple guardians unsettled. Evening shadows stretched across the colonnades, and the city seemed to sigh at the absurdity of bureaucracy spilling into worship. A clerk, balanced on a low stool, tried to reconcile the new tax tables, while a child tugged at his sleeve, offering a cracked clay cup of water as if it could solve the paperwork. The high priest, his face blurred by torchlight, lifted a concealed offering to a deity whose statue was veiled in sand, the gesture both reverent and oddly out of step with the freshly minted statutes. Meanwhile, the vizier adjusted his linen kilt, the fabric rustling softly, and muttered about order as the market stalls clanged with the familiar rhythm of barter. The irony lay in the quiet hum of daily chores continuing unabated, while the very language of the divine was being rewritten in the same ink that stained the merchant's hands. Night fell gently over the Nile, and the temperature slipped into a cool, comforting hush that settled over the city like a soft blanket. In the courtyard, the priests lit a modest lantern, its flame flickering against the stone, and resumed a muted chant that blended with the distant croak of waterfowl. Workers returning from the fields brushed dust from their sleeves, their feet sighing against the worn bricks as they entered the temple courtyards for a simple meal of flatbread and dates. The reforms, now a quiet backdrop, no longer rattled the air. Instead, the sound of a pot being stirred and the low murmur of conversation filled the space where earlier unrest had brewed. The kingdom, though reshaped, settled into a rhythm as predictable as the tide, each heartbeat echoing the soft percussion of a world that continued to turn. When later scribes recorded these days, their tablets bore a sober tone, noting how the blurred visage of a hidden deity watched over a people who learned to carry both change and tradition in their hands. The memory of Neferet's scroll lingered like the faint scent of lotus blossoms that never fully faded, reminding future generations that certainty is often a thin veil over ordinary lives. The priests, their robes now dusted with the patina of time, smiled faintly at the thought that even the most solemn rituals could accommodate a whisper of humor. Children in the courtyard still chased each other's shadows, their laughter a gentle reminder that history moves at a pace measured in breaths, not battles. In the quiet after the storm, the kingdom found a gentle equilibrium, a soft lesson that human imperfection and quiet resilience are the true foundations of any enduring faith. In the early light of a Theban morning, the riverbank hummed with the soft splash of papyrus boats, and the steady rhythm of looms in the workshop rose. Merchants arranged baskets of figs and barley beneath the cool shade of palm trunks, while the temple courtyard kept its cool stone silence, its high priests moving like shadows, their faces forever blurred by the glare of incense smoke. Children traced lazy patterns in the dust, unaware of the distant clatter of marching boots that would soon echo across the Nile. The city's walls, warm with the amber heat of the day, seemed to hold a steady pulse, a quiet assurance that the gods watched from unseeable heights. In this ordinary calm, the familiar cadence of life in Thebes felt as timeless as the stones themselves. When the northern warlords pressed their spears into the outer gates, a low rumble rose like a distant thunderstorm, shaking the market stalls and sending figs scattering across the cobblestones. The clang of armor mingled with the mournful sigh of temple bells, creating a discordant soundtrack to the once steady rhythm of daily chores. Citizens paused mid-step, their hands still half full of grain, as the sight of dust-kissed banners fluttering above the palace walls introduced a new, uneasy temperature to the air. Whispered conversations slipped through narrow alleys, the words trembling like reed pens across parchment, questioning whether the old deities would intervene or remain indifferent. Even the river, usually a calm mirror, seemed to ripple with an undercurrent of uncertainty, reflecting a city caught between reverence and dread. Amid the clamor, a subtle irony unfolded. Small groups gathered after dusk in the narrow recesses of sun-worn columns, their candles flickering against walls where the name of Ra was etched in a half-erased script. These clandestine circles exchanged sips of honeyed wine, their laughter low and dry, as they shared stories of old sun rays slipping through the cracks of a fractured hierarchy. The priests, whose silhouettes remained forever hidden behind the heavy veil of sandalwood smoke, watched from a distance, their eyes reflecting a bemused resignation. The people, once content to chant familiar hymns, now whispered about a solitary sun that might rise without royal decree, finding a curious comfort in the very act of questioning. This quiet rebellion, wrapped in the soft rustle of papyrus scrolls, turned the solemnity of worship into a gentle, almost humorous, contemplation of belief. As weeks turned to months, the clatter of war softened, and the market's rhythm returned to its familiar cadence, the sound of barter, and the scent of baked flatbread filling the air once more. Artisans resumed the steady tap of chisels on stone, their hands warm against the cool limestone, while women gathered on low stools to braid hair. The soft swish of reeds, a reminder of continuity. The sun rose each day over Thebes with the same amber glow, its light slipping through the same cracks in the temple walls. Yet now it greeted a city whose people carried a quieter, more personal reverence. Even the once blurry faces of the priests seemed to settle into a resigned acceptance, their shadows lengthening over stone benches where weary travelers rested. In the evening, the river's gentle lapping against the quay became a shared lullaby, soothing the lingering tension into a settled, if altered, peace. Later scribes would note, in the margins of their stone tablets, the faint imprint of this transformation, describing how the hidden glances toward the sun hinted at a broader reshaping of devotion without abandoning the old rites. They recorded the way Thebans, after the clamor, learned to hold both the ancient statues and the new whispers of Ra in the same palm, feeling the rough grain of limestone against their skin, while the warm breeze carried a distant, unspoken promise. The blurred visages of prophets, forever cloaked in shadow, became symbols of humanity's persistent search for meaning amid turmoil. Observers, centuries removed, would watch the city's quiet streets and hear the distant echo of artisans' tools, sensing a lingering calm that survived the storm. In that stillness, the story of Thebes remained a gentle reminder that even the fiercest upheavals can settle into ordinary moments, where history rests lightly on the shoulders of those who simply keep walking. In the cool shadows of the Karnak courtyard, Priestess Maya traced the worn limestone steps with fingertips dusted in sun-baked sand, her mind tuned to the steady hiss of incense rising from the altar of Amun. The walls, lined with hieroglyphs, caught the muted gold of the late afternoon, while a distant clatter of chariots reminded her that the kingdom was still unsettled under the usurper's thin smile. Daily offerings of barley and lotus blossoms continued, their weight steady in her hands, as if the world had not shifted beneath the throne. She whispered prayers to a deity whose face remained forever blurred by the flickering torchlight, a reminder of the unseen power that lingered in ritual. The air held a faint chill, an unspoken promise that something larger than the temple's stones was stirring. When General Hormheb's legion arrived at the city gates, the rhythm of marching sandals broke the temple's usual cadence, echoing against the basalt columns like a drumbeat of inevitability. Soldiers' shields clanged, sending small clouds of dust to drift over the statues, and the scent of iron mingled with the lingering incense, creating a tense mash of aromas. Maya felt the cool marble under her feet vibrate as the usurper's palace collapsed in a sudden, measured roar, the walls shaking but not crumbling. Behind the chaos, the hidden faces of officials, veiled by shadow and the flare of torches, stayed indistinct, their expressions unreadable as they vanished into darkness. The city settled into an uneasy silence, the kind that follows a storm, where even the river seemed to pause its flow. In the weeks that followed, the new council gathered under a banner that blended the feathered plume of Mad with the coil of a serpent, an odd synthesis that made Maya's careful hands tremble as she arranged the newly prescribed offerings. The scribe, his face forever concealed by the glare of a copper lamp, recited a litany that wove Amun's name with that of a foreign god, each syllable sounding like a half-remembered lullaby. The incense burners were rearranged, their smoke curling in unfamiliar patterns that brushed the cool stone like a gentle sigh. Maya observed the irony of a ceremony meant to stabilize the realm now, feeling like a tentative dance between old habit and forced novelty. Even the temple cat, unperturbed, padded across the polished floor, indifferent to the theological reshuffle that surrounded it. As the sun slipped behind the dunes, casting long amber ribbons across the courtyard, daily life resumed with a softened rhythm. Vendors set out baskets of figs, their skins warm to the touch, while water jars clinked softly in the shade. Maya, now accustomed to the blended rites, moved through the temple with a measured grace, her robes rustling quietly like pages turning in an old papyrus. The altered prayers echoed faintly, their cadence steady, and the unseen priests, still hidden in the half-light, performed their duties with a calm resignation that mirrored the evening's gentle hush. A breeze brushed past, carrying the faint taste of cumin and the distant murmur of a river, reminding her that the world continued its slow turn regardless of decrees. The city lights flickered on, their orange glow wrapping the stone walls in a comforting, if modest, luminescence. When Maya later sat by the courtyard's low stone bench, she let the night air settle around her, feeling the coolness of the tiles against her knees and the faint echo of distant drums long faded. She thought of the blurred faces that had directed the upheaval, realizing that power, like incense, rose and dispersed without ever truly revealing its source. The syncretic rituals now felt like a quiet compromise, a reminder that human attempts to rewrite the sacred are as fragile as a papyrus scroll left in the sand. In the soft glow of the moon, she sensed a gentle humor in the persistence of ordinary tasks, sweeping, offering, listening, surviving beyond the grand narratives of coups and kings. With a faint smile, she let the stillness speak, acknowledging that history, much like sleep, carries on in the quiet spaces between its louder moments. When the waters rose beyond the usual banks, the air grew thick with the scent of wet reeds and the low murmur of displaced villagers. Farmers leaned against splintered boats, feeling the cool mud cling to their sandals as they watched the river swallow fields they had tended for generations. In the shadow of the great temple of Karnak, the stone columns appeared to shiver under the weight of the flood, their surfaces slick with rain. A handful of priests stood at the entrance, their robes darkened, eyes fixed on the horizon, while their faces remained veiled by the falling light. The quiet rhythm of dripping water set a patient tempo for the whole scene, as if history itself held its breath. Soon, whispers turned to murmurs of disappointment, then to a low tide of accusation that rose faster than the river had. Market women pointed to the towering statues, their voices trembling as they blamed the unseen gods for a betrayal hidden in recent political edicts. Rival clergy, one faction cloaked in white linen, the other in dark netted shawls, exchanged sharp glances, each hand gripping a carved staff that felt suddenly heavier. Their silhouettes were outlined against the smoldering incense, but the faces of the high priests remained blurred, hidden by shadows that seemed to swallow even the torchlight. The tension crackled like distant thunder, yet the flood's roar continued its steady, indifferent chant. When the council convened inside the temple courtyard, the irony of the moment lingered like a dry leaf on still water. The two priestly groups, once proud competitors, now presented identical offerings of barley and lotus blossoms on the same altar, the bowls clinking in a quiet, almost comical synchrony. Their gestures were careful, almost rehearsed, as if the act of cooperation itself were a performance watched by unseen eyes behind the veil of light. The high priests, still faceless, raised their hands together, and a thin plume of incense curled upward, mixing the scents of earth and water in a subtle reminder of shared humanity. The surrounding columns seemed to sigh, their stone surfaces absorbing the soft humor of a rivalry forced into unity. After the rain receded, the temple courtyard settled into a gentle hush, the stone floor cooling under the evening sky's amber glow. Priests, now side by side, brushed dust from their sandals and exchanged simple nods, their voices barely audible above the distant croak of frogs returning to the marshes. Children from nearby homes lingered near the steps, tracing the patterns of fallen leaves with sticky fingers, while an elderly scribe polished a basalt tablet, the motion slow and deliberate. The shared incense continued to drift, its warm amber smoke wrapping the space in a blanket of calm. As the water's edge retreated and exposed the familiar rhythm of daily life, in that quiet, the political discord seemed as distant as the fading echo of a storm. In the years that followed, the temple's rituals subtly shifted, incorporating prayers that spoke of balance rather than dominance, a testament to the fleeting flood that had reshaped belief. The once rigid division between the white and dark clergy softened, their records now marked with joint entries whose handwriting intertwined like the reeds along the riverbank. Visitors strolling past the temple would catch glimpses of priests walking together, their footsteps echoing a slower, steadier cadence across the polished stone. The memory of the flood lingered in the coolness of the night air, a gentle reminder that even the grandest powers are subject to the same tides that move ordinary souls. History, in its patient way, recorded the change not with trumpets, but with the soft rustle of papyrus and the quiet sigh of water receding into the earth. The Nile's waters moved slower than usual as the city of Thebes awoke to a quiet dawn, dust still lingering from the night's distant clashes. Men in linen, shuttles pushed carts of barley, while the distant echo of bronze armor faded into the wind. In the shadowed courtyards, the faces of the high priesthood were hidden by the low light, their presence felt more than seen. The last royal decree, inked in haste, promised a return to order, yet the air held a faint chill of uncertainty. Workers paused, feeling the stone floor beneath their sandals, aware that stability was a promise, not yet a reality. By midday, a council of pharaohs and senior priests gathered beneath the colonnades of the great hypostyle hall, the murmuring of reeds outside barely breaking their concentration. The council's tables were strewn with papyrus scrolls, their edges crisp, while the scent of incense rose in thin, wavering curls. Voices rose and fell like the Nile's tide, each argument a gentle ripple against the stone walls, marked by the soft scrape of stylus on parchment. Though the leaders spoke of unity, the shadows on the reliefs seemed to shift, as if the gods themselves were watching unseen, their faces blurred by the flickering torchlight. The negotiations stretched into the heat of the afternoon, leaving a lingering hum of anticipation in every vaulted column. When the council finally settled, an unexpected compromise emerged, a hybrid order that honored both Amun's hidden sanctuaries and Ra's blazing sunrise. The ceremony to seal this pact was conducted in the courtyard, where light filtered through a canopy of palm fronds, casting patterned shadows on the sand. The priest who whispered the oath kept his features concealed in the glare, his silhouette merging with the brightening sky. As the attendants lifted vessels of cool water, the surface quivered, reflecting the muted gold of the setting sun. A quiet irony that the most solemn vows were spoken beneath an ordinary evening breeze. The crowd, accustomed to solemn declarations, exchanged subdued nods, their hands brushing the cool stone, feeling the weight of a new yet familiar reverence settle like dust. In the weeks that followed, daily life adjusted to the blended rites with a gentle rhythm. Farmers offered a modest libation to both deities before planting, their hands rough from the soil, while scribes recorded offerings on tablets that balanced symbols of feather and solar disk. Children in simple linen dresses played near the temple steps, their laughter echoing softly against the stone. Unaware of the political undercurrents that had reshaped their world, the priests, still cloaked in anonymity, guided the ceremonies with measured gestures. The sound of their chants, a low, steady hum that blended with the rustle of papyrus fans. Evening markets glowed with amber lanterns, their light warm against the cool night air, as merchants traded pottery bearing both the crook of a shepherd's staff and the sun's disk. The city settled into a measured cadence, each breath of wind through the reeds a reminder of the newfound equilibrium. Years later, the legacy of the council was felt in the quiet reverence of generations who never witnessed the turmoil that birthed it. Elders traced the smooth edges of combined altar stones with fingertips, feeling the faint imprint of centuries, while the scent of incense still rose in thin spirals. Neither solely Amun's incense nor purely Ra's offering, but a subtle blend. The blurred faces of the original emissaries remained a quiet lesson, their anonymity reminding listeners that power and faith often hide behind ordinary gestures. Children, now grown, taught their own offspring the rhythm of prayers that began with a compromise, their voices soft as the rustling papyrus reeds beside the river. In the stillness of night, when the moon cast gentle silver across the temple rooftops. The city breathed a measured sigh, acknowledging that stability, like a slow river, arrives not with a flash, but with patient flow. Along the mellow bend of the Nile, the early light brushed the reeds with a soft amber hue as High Priest Anan guided his apprentice Khepri through the familiar rhythm of the annual inundation. The water rose slowly, touching the mud bricks of the temple walls with a whisper that the farmers had learned to read for years. Their sandals left faint impressions in the damp sand, and the distant croak of frogs punctuated the quiet air. Anan lifted the ceremonial staff, and together they began the opening of the waters, a measured chant that seemed to echo the river's own pulse. Khepri's hands traced the cool edge of the basket holding offerings, feeling the weight of generations in each grain of barley. The scene unfolded with a patient certainty, as if the calendar itself were a gentle river flowing toward a known shore. Later that week, the river's edge showed a subtle hesitation. The flood arrived a few days later than the markings on the stone tablets predicted. Farmers who habitually watched the first ripple now frowned, feeling the extra heat of the sun linger on their backs longer than usual. The moisture in the air felt thinner, and the usual scent of wet silt was faint, replaced by a dry, dusty smell that clung to the market stalls. Anan noted the delay in his ledger, his finger tracing the numbers without voice, while Khepri whispered a question about the clouds that seemed reluctant to gather. The hushed conversations among the laborers carried an undercurrent of unease, their tools resting a moment longer in the shade. Even the reeds swayed a little slower, as if hearing the nervous sighs of the people who depended on them. Amid the unsettled atmosphere, the faces of the priestly figures remained indistinct, blurred by the glare of the setting sun that painted them in gentle silhouettes. The river, once a reliable promise, now offered a quiet irony. Its waters rose, but not with the punctual certainty that the calendar had once guaranteed. Khepri watched a farmer pause, his hands covered in loam, and smile faintly at the absurdity of trusting a flood that seemed to negotiate its own schedule. The ritual drums sounded, their beats steady yet strangely out of sync with the sluggish current. A soft reminder that human patterns can be outpaced by nature's subtle shifts. Anan's voice carried the same measured tone, but the echo in the stone courtyard felt a little more distant, as if the walls themselves were listening to a different tempo. The scene held a calm amusement, a small acknowledgement that the grand designs of the ancestors were being rewritten in quiet margins. In the days that followed, the priests adjusted their steps, allowing the ceremony to linger longer beside the banks, feeling the cool moisture of the water against their forearms. The farmers, after a brief pause, resumed planting, their hands moving through the softer soil with a patient acceptance that mirrored the river's delayed flow. Shadows stretched across the temple courtyard, and the soft rustle of papyrus scrolls blended with the quiet splatter of water against stone. Anan, his robe lightly damp, watched the water recede at a measured pace, noting each centimeter with a calm, almost indifferent precision. Khepri, now more accustomed to the altered rhythm, laughed lowly at a child's attempt to catch a drifting leaf. The humor, a small bridge over the tension of change. The whole community settled into a new equilibrium. The calendar's ink slowly shifting to accommodate the river's size. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the night air carried a faint chill that contrasted with the day's lingering warmth, reminding all present of the balance between heat and cool. Anan reflected on the ledger, its entries now marked with uncertain dates. Yet he recognized a quiet resilience in the faces of those who worked the fields. Khepri, his eyes half closed, sensed that the river's altered cadence was a lesson in humility, a reminder that human plans are always provisional. The temple lights flickered softly, casting gentle shadows that made the ancient stone feel less like a monument and more like a shelter for weary thoughts. Farmers returned home, their silhouettes merging with the darkness, each step a soft imprint on the sand that would soon be washed anew. In that lingering hush, history seemed to exhale, acknowledging both the fragility and the stubborn continuity of human life beside a river that still, in its own way, whispered promises. When the first warm wind of the season brushed the reeds along the western banks, the Nile began its familiar sigh, swelling over the stone embankments with a steady, low roar. Farmers watched the water climb, feeling the cool mist on their skin as they set out small wooden baskets to collect the silvery sheen that promised life. In the village square, the scent of wet silt mingled with the aroma of freshly baked flatbread, while children traced the receding shoreline with bare feet. Elders marked the day on their clay tablets, noting the exact hour when the water touched the lowest stone of the southern quay. All eyes turned toward the ritual basin, ready for the first offering to the hidden face of Happy, whose presence was felt more than seen. The expected surge arrived late, a thin ribbon of water that barely brushed the outer walls before retreating under a pale sky. The basin that should have echoed with the clink of copper vessels remained empty, its stone surface cool and unmarked, while the priest, his features concealed by the shadow of his headdress, lifted his hands in a quiet pause. The village felt a subtle shift in the temperature, a lingering dampness that clung to the thatch roofs and the backs of laborers' necks. Fields that usually glistened with abundant moisture showed patches of brown, and the whisper of rustling stalks carried a tone of early fatigue. The mist offering lingered like a thin thread of smoke, unnoticed by the gods, but felt by the people who had counted on its certainty. Anan called the Council of Seasons to convene beneath the cracked stone columns of the temple, where scholars gathered with scrolls stained by river water. Their voices rose in low debate, the crackle of parchment mixing with the distant rush of a hesitant current, as they argued whether the heavens themselves were rearranging their course. The chief scribe, his face blurred by the flickering torchlight, pointed to a map where the flood line had slipped inward, suggesting a pattern beyond mortal control. An uneasy chuckle passed through the assembly, a quiet acknowledgement that the very climate they had trusted was now an unpredictable companion. Yet the council kept its tone measured, noting the irony that the people who once read the river as a divine timetable now read it as a symptom of a shifting world. In the days that followed, villagers adjusted their steps as if learning a new dance, timing the planting of seedlings to the softer pulse of the water. Mothers guided their children to fetch water from narrower channels, the splash of their jars sounding like gentle applause in the still afternoon air. The ritual basin was filled later, its surface reflecting the orange glow of sunset, while the priest, still unseen, offered a modest libation that resonated with the community's quiet resilience. The fields, though bruised at the edges, began to sprout green shoots that swayed gently, as if grateful for the altered rhythm. Evening chants were whispered slower, each syllable lingering like warm breath on stone, stitching together a calm acceptance of the changed tide. Years later, the elders would sit on the worn wooden benches of the courtyard, their hands tracing the lines of old tablets as the river flowed with a steadier, though never fully predictable, cadence. They recalled the mist, offering not as a failure, but as a moment that taught the village to listen more closely to the earth beneath their feet. The hidden faces of the priests remained a soft mystery, their anonymity reminding each generation that the divine is often a quiet backdrop to human effort. Children, now grown, taught their own offspring to watch the water's surface for the slightest ripple, learning to adapt before any official decree. In the soft hush of twilight, the community found a gentle moral that impermanence, like the river, shapes rituals as much as rituals shape lives, and the stillness between waves holds the true story of endurance. The summer heat over Thebes had settled into a thin, dry sigh that clung to the sandstone walls, and the Nile's usual murmur was reduced to a hesitant trickle. Khepri, a junior scribe with ink-smudged fingers, brushed dust from a cracked limestone tablet uncovered in the storage courtyard, its symbols echoing older floods and past famines. The priests gathered around the slab, their robes rustling like parchment, while the sun painted their silhouettes in soft amber, their faces hidden in the shade of the colonnade. The tablet spoke of earlier climate shifts that had forced ancient festivals to move, a notion that seemed both distant and urgent. As the wind carried the faint scent of dried figs, the city felt the weight of a calendar that might no longer match the sky. Inside the cool sanctuary, the high priests traced the fixed 365-day marks on the stone floor, each line feeling steadier than the parched earth beyond the walls. Their voices rose and fell like the quiet drip of a leaky cistern, debating whether to amend the ritual sequence or trust the old order despite the relentless drought. Kepri watched the scrolls shift under trembling hands, the sound of reed pens scratching a nervous rhythm. Outside, market stalls creaked under the weight of empty baskets, and the murmurs of restless citizens slipped through the open doors like dry sand. The tension settled into a heavy stillness, as if the very air were holding its breath for a decision that might summon either relief or divine displeasure. A senior priest, whose profile was forever softened by shadow, offered a wry observation that the Nile had once altered its own timetable without consulting any altar, and that the gods might simply be amused by human insistence on rigidity. A faint chuckle rose from a group of apprentices, their laughter barely stirring the dust at their feet, while a servant handed out flatbread that felt like paper in dry hands. The irony lingered in the way the calendar, meant to order time, now seemed as fragile as a cracked jar of water. Even the temple cats, prowling lazily along the columns, paused as if to listen to the absurdity of a civilization trying to rewrite the sky. The moment was quiet, yet it carried the soft hum of human awareness that even solemn rites could be bent by circumstance. Later, as the sun slipped toward the horizon, the priests stood shoulder to shoulder beneath a canopy of woven reeds, their gestures slow and deliberate as they poured a modest offering into the dwindling canal. The water glistened faintly, catching the amber light, while nearby women stirred barley stew, the steam rising in thin, forgiving curls. Children traced circles in the mud, unaware of the calendar debate, their feet leaving tiny imprints that the earth would soon forget. The city moved on in measured steps, the rhythm of daily chores, mending baskets, polishing stone, sharing stories, blurring the edge of the earlier urgency. In the hush that settled over the courtyards, the ritual became less a proclamation of control and more a quiet acknowledgement of shared endurance. When the season turned and the Nile finally rose enough to fill the low-lying fields, the priests recorded the event on fresh tablets, noting the subtle shift without fanfare. Ketri, now older, traced the ink with a gentle finger, feeling the grain of the stone and the faint coolness of the water that had returned. The calendar remained unchanged, but its meaning had softened, as if the stone itself had learned to listen to the wind. Visitors to the temple later would glimpse the worn faces of the custodians, their expressions blurred by the soft lamplight, reflecting on how humanity's attempts to command nature are always tempered by nature's quiet humor. In the quiet of the night, the city slept under a sky that had steadied, and the story of the drought lingered like a faint scent, reminding future generations of the delicate balance between order and the inevitable flow of change. The morning light was swallowed by a relentless sandstorm that drifted like gray wool through the streets of the capital. Grainy wind hissed against stone walls, coating the columns of the Temple of Happy in a thin veil of trembling dust. At the same time, the Nile, swollen by unusual rains farther upstream, breached its ancient banks and surged into the low plazas, turning the cobblestones slick and cold. The water lapped against the alabaster steps, dislodging the ritual basins that had once reflected the sun's steady march. When the waters finally receded, they left behind a shallow choir of mud and broken reed mats, a quiet that sounded louder than the earlier roar. In the lingering haze, the city's daily rhythm paused, as if the calendar itself had been knocked off its stone hinge. Anan, a scribe whose hands were accustomed to the thin scrape of reed pens, stood on the cracked embankment and watched the floodwaters stain the market stalls. The usual clatter of merchants arranging figs and pottery was muffled by the constant sigh of water seeping through woven baskets. Children, whose games normally echoed in the courtyard, now shuffled barefoot through ankle-deep slime, their laughter reduced to an occasional splash. The temple's priests, their faces blurred by the haze and the drooping light, gathered in the shadow of the collapsed sanctuary, their chants swallowed by the wet air. Anan felt a sharp knot of desperation tighten as he counted the days marked on the wall calendar, days that no longer matched the rhythm of the sky or the river. He lowered his palm to the cool mud, feeling the grainy texture slip through his fingers, and realized that the old system was slipping away as surely as the water. With a notebook tucked under his arm, Anan approached the palace courtyard, where the pharaoh's throne room glimmered with the faint amber of oil lamps. He placed a simple petition on the polished stone, the parchment damp but legible, proposing a calendar based on the observable rise of the sun over the western sand dunes and the seasonal push of the Nile. The scribe's words were spoken aloud by a low-voiced attendant, whose face remained hidden behind the shadow of a linen veil, emphasizing the anonymity of the plea. The irony lay in the fact that the ancient myths had once been born from the same observations, now forgotten in favor of ceremonial dates that no longer coaxed the river to obey. As the petition was sealed with a dried palm leaf, a quiet chuckle seemed to drift through the marble hall, a reminder that even great rulers must sometimes listen to the whisper of ordinary hands. The pharaoh, seated on a throne worn smooth by centuries, lifted his gaze from the scroll and let his eyes linger on the distant horizon, where the sun painted the desert in a soft amber. A servant placed a cup of lukewarm barley water before him, the steam rising in thin ribbons that tangled momentarily with the drifting dust outside. In the hushed pause, the court's attendants shifted their sandals, the faint creak of wood echoing like a slow heartbeat across the room. After a measured breath, the pharaoh nodded, his hand resting lightly on the cool stone, indicating a willingness to let the river's pulse guide the festivals anew. The decision was recorded by the palace scribes, their reed pens gliding over fresh papyrus with a steady, almost sleepy rhythm. As the night deepened, the palace courtyard emptied, leaving only the distant murmur of the Nile and the faint rustle of sand as the new calendar's first marker was set. In the weeks that followed, farmers adjusted planting times by watching the first light crest the dunes, while priests marked the new dates with modest clay tablets instead of ornate stone stelae. The Temple of Happy, though damaged, was rebuilt with simple columns that bore no grand inscriptions, but rather a modest line noting the day the water first receded. Anan walked the market streets, now calm, feeling the cool breath of evening settle on his shoulders, and noticed how the ordinary chatter of sellers returned, steadier than before. The city's rhythm settled into a gentle cadence, a reminder that human calendars are as mutable as the sands that surround them. In that quiet acceptance, the people found a soft dignity, recognizing that survival often rests not on grand mythic cycles, but on the patient observation of each fleeting, observable moment. In the cool light of early dawn, the pharaoh stood on the mud brick terrace and lifted a polished sundial toward the rising sun, his hand steady against the gentle heat of the Nile breezes. He whispered a decree, his voice low enough to blend with the distant murmur of water, that the ancient ritual calendar would be revised to follow the shifting sunrise and the increasingly erratic flood. Scribes traced new symbols on papyrus, their reeds scratching the surface as they recorded the latest astronomical tables alongside the patterns of water levels observed by seasoned boatmen. The people watched the ceremony from the shade of palm fronds, their eyes tracing the slow arc of the sun as it painted the limestone walls with amber. A subtle anticipation settled over the crowd, a quiet recognition that time itself was being remeasured. Soon after the announcement, the market stalls began to shuffle as merchants adjusted the dates on their ledger boxes. The clink of copper coins sounding a little sharper than before. Farmers felt the weight of the rising temperature in the grit of the sand under their sandals, noticing how the flood now arrived a week later than the ancients had recorded. In the evenings, elders gathered near the riverbank, their voices low, sharing stories of once predictable inundations, while the water now whispered a more hesitant rhythm. The tension rose like the soft swell of a reed flute, each ripple a reminder that the old calculations no longer matched the living world. Yet no one spoke loudly of panic. Instead, a measured silence settled, like dust settling on a statue after a wind gust. When the first hybrid festival approached, the city's streets filled with banners of faded gold, their edges frayed by the warm wind that carried the scent of reeds and baked bread. Priests with faces blurred by the glare of torches guided the procession, their chants muting into a soft hum that seemed to acknowledge the absurdity of honoring deities, while simultaneously charting climate data. Children tugged at their mothers' linen robes, laughing at the sight of a water clock perched beside a solar panel that gleamed like a polished stone. The irony lingered in the air, gentle as the rustle of papyrus, as old prayers were whispered alongside practical pleas for a steady river. In the background, the Nile reflected the amber sky, a quiet mirror to the juxtaposition of tradition and adaptation. The ceremony unfolded with a calm rhythm, each participant moving as if guided by the slow tide itself. Musicians tapped their lyres, the notes low and warm, while women poured cool water from clay jars onto the stone altar, the splash echoing faintly against the walls. The pharaoh, his silhouette softened by the setting sun, observed the crowd with a measured gaze, the corners of his mouth barely lifting in a restrained smile. As the sun slipped lower, shadows lengthened, and the hybrid offerings were laid side by side. The scene felt like a seamless thread weaving past and present. The collective breath of the gathered people settled into a steady, almost sleepy cadence, matching the river's gentle flow. When night fell, the city rested under a blanket of muted orange, the Nile's surface now a calm glass reflecting distant lanterns. In the quiet, the scribes closed their scrolls, the soft rustle of parchment, a reminder of recorded change and enduring habit. The people, tired yet content, slipped into stone-cold rooms, the cool touch of the walls grounding them after the day's adjustments. Their thoughts lingered on the subtle lesson that even the most ancient rhythms must bend to the warmth of a changing world. a thought both humble and slightly melancholy. In that lingering stillness, the continuity of ritual held, not as an unbroken chain, but as a flexible strand that bent gently with the wind. In the early glow of Thebes, market stalls thrum with the clatter of copper pots and the soft shuffle of linen robes as the priesthood readies the opet procession. High Priest Amenemhat, whose face remains hidden behind the bronze gleam of his headdress, inspects the worn wooden bark that will carry the statue of Amun toward the southern temple. The royal family, draped in pale linen and modest gold bands, moves through the crowd with measured steps, their sandals sighing against the hot stone streets. Women carrying baskets of figs and barley pause to smooth the cracked paint on the ceremonial banners, their fingers tracing the fading hieroglyphs. The air carries a warm perfume of incense mixed with the distant murmur of the Nile, promising renewal even as the decorations show a faint dust of neglect. As the sun climbs, the chanting choirs begin, their voices echoing off the sandstone walls, but sounding a shade thinner than the generations before. The drums, once resonant, now tap with a muted thud, as if the leather skins have forgotten the vigor of earlier celebrations. Children who once sprinted ahead to catch a glimpse of the bark linger near the steps, their eyes half closed, the excitement dulled by the routine of yearly rites. A senior scribe pauses, his reed pen scratching slower across parchment, noting the ragged edge of a fringe that once fluttered proudly in the wind. The procession advances with a careful cadence, each footfall measured, revealing the subtle tension between reverence and the wear of countless repetitions. The gilded bark glides on the riverbank, its polished surfaces reflecting the sky in a way that feels more like a tired mirror than a divine vessel. Spectators smile politely, their expressions soft and a touch weary, as if the grandeur they witness is a polite performance rather than a heartfelt communion. An elderly baker offers a handful of dates to a passerby, the gesture uncomplicated yet oddly comedic against the solemn backdrop of ritual. Even the priest's robes, once crisp, now bear faint creases that speak of countless days of folding and unfolding. A quiet irony that the sacred can be so ordinary. The whole scene unfolds like a well-rehearsed play, where the audience knows the lines, but still finds a faint chuckle in the disparity between splendor and the ordinary wear of the participants. When the bark reaches the sanctuary, the crowd thins, leaving only a few lanterns flickering against the night's cool breath. The priests lower the statue with reverent hands, the wood sighing softly as it settles onto the altar stone that has warmed through centuries. A gentle breeze brushes past, carrying the faint scent of papyrus and distant reeds, soothing the lingering fatigue of the day's labor. The royal couple retreats to a shaded courtyard, their shadows stretching lazily across the walls, while a servant pours cool date juice into muted clay cups. In the quiet that follows, the city's heartbeat steadies, the echo of chants fading like a distant lullaby, leaving only the steady rustle of palm fronds. Later, as the moon rises over the western horizon, the streets of Thebes settle into a soft hush, and the remnants of the festival linger like a half-remembered dream. Amenemhat remains by the altar, his silhouette blurred by the waning torchlight, contemplating the worn edges of the ceremony he has shepherded for years. The worn banners sway gently, reminding the few night workers that even rituals of power are subject to time's patient erosion. A young apprentice, wiping soot from his hands, pauses to listen to the faint crackle of cooling incense, feeling the weight of continuity balanced against inevitable change. In that stillness, the city embraces a quiet acknowledgement. The Opet festival endures not through flawless spectacle, but through the steady, imperfect steps of ordinary people who keep the memory alive. At dawn, the royal bark rested on the softened mud, its cedar hull darkening against the pale sky, while the Nile's surface reflected the first amber glow. A handful of oarsmen traced slow circles in the shallow water, the sound of wooden blades splashing a gentle rhythm that mingled with the distant call of a heron. The air carried the faint scent of papyrus and river reeds, cooling the bronze ornaments that lay draped over the boat's railings. Priests in linen skirts stood at the prow, their faces hidden in the shadow of wide-brimmed crowns, watching the water without overt reverence. Below, farmers leaned on their staffs, eyes turning toward the procession as if waiting for a promise of another fertile year. Soon, a thin breeze carried whispers from the palace courtyard, where a rival vizier slipped rumors of misappropriated grain into the ears of waiting merchants. The market stalls near the quay began to clatter with nervous shouts as baskets of dates and barley were weighed more heavily against rising taxes. In the distance, the floodwaters that usually lapped up to the bark's edges had already begun to recede, exposing cracked riverbanks that seemed to swallow the water's former abundance. Voices grew louder, a low hum of discontent that rippled across the deck, while the sun grew hotter on the stone steps where officials waited. The ceremony's symbolic fertility felt suddenly out of step with the dry, uneven mud that now cradled the bark. Against this backdrop, the vizier's accusations drifted like careless dust. Yet the rowers continued their measured strokes, their muscles moving in a practiced cadence that ignored the murmurs. Merchants muttered about the weight of levy tablets as they shuffled past the procession, their hands clasping tightly around coins that felt heavier than usual. The bark, still bearing its painted pennants, progressed under a sky that had turned a muted ochre, the irony of its forward motion stark against the retreating flood. The priest, whose face remained concealed by the veil of his headdress, offered a quiet chant that seemed more a sigh than a summons. Even as the crowd's impatience hardened, the river's current, though weak, obliged the vessel to glide forward, a subtle reminder that tradition can persist despite doubt. Soon the clamor softened, replaced by the soft creak of the bark's hull and the occasional splash of an oar breaking the surface. Sunlight warmed the smooth limestone steps, and a faint scent of baked wheat drifted from nearby granaries, mixing with the river's cool breath. Spectators settled onto low benches, their eyes following the slow glide of the boat, the scene unfolding like a quiet film projected on the horizon. The vizier, his cloak rustling, watched from a marble platform, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his headdress. The procession continued, each movement measured, each gesture echoing a rhythm that had outlasted countless reigns, allowing the ceremony to breathe in the stillness of the afternoon. As the bark disappeared beyond the bend where the river narrowed, a gentle hush settled over the quay, and participants lingered, tracing the worn patterns of stone with their fingertips. The fading light painted the water in soft amber, reminding the gathered few of the fleeting nature of both flood and festivity. In that quiet, thoughts turned inward, wondering whether the ancient rite still held meaning for a world where grain could be taxed and waters could wane earlier each year. The hidden faces of the priests, still cloaked in shadow, seemed to ask no question, merely to observe the patient endurance of human habit. With a final sigh of the wind through reeds, the day slipped toward evening, leaving behind a calm that felt both weary and oddly hopeful. In the waning light of the great courtyard, the stone hands of aging artisans traced the fine cracks of statues that had once stood proudly beneath the festival banners. Their tools whispered against limestone, dust rising like slow incense, while caravans from distant lands left behind shells of exotic pottery and muted chants of unfamiliar deities. The priests gathered beneath the colonnade, their robes rustling, and debated whether to stitch these new verses into the old Oppet procession, or let the threads fall silent. The river beyond carried the scent of riverine reeds and distant markets, a reminder that the world outside the temple walls was reshaping itself. Yet the central altar remained cool, its surface reflecting the dim glow of oil lamps that had burned unchanged for generations. As the months stretched, the statues showed deeper fissures, and the artisan's hands grew slower, their breath visible in the evening chill that crept through the stone arches. Foreign merchants set up stalls near the sanctuary, their voices echoing with the names of gods whose names were difficult to pronounce, and their goods clinked against the marble steps, creating a subtle discord in the once unified rhythm of the rites. Military messengers arrived with maps of new forts, their boots rattling on the pavement, shifting the kingdom's attention toward campaigns and canals rather than ceremonial splendor. The priests felt the weight of these changes in the hollow echoes of the prayer halls, where chants now seemed to compete with the distant clang of swords being forged. A palpable tension lingered as the familiar cadence of the Opit festival began to feel out of step with the nation's hurried pulse. In a council beneath the shade of a cracked obelisk, the high priest raised a staff, its tip catching the last amber sun. Yet the faces of the divine emissaries on the reliefs remained blurred by the sinking light. He suggested weaving the foreign hymns into the procession, a compromise that elicited a faint, weary chuckle from a junior scribe who noted the irony of adapting a tradition meant to assert constancy. The debate unfolded in quiet tones, punctuated by the soft scrape of chisel against stone, as a statue was gently nudged back into place, its repaired smile barely hiding the wear of ages. Yet the ceremony, now a tapestry of old and new threads, seemed to lose some of its original gravity, as if the sacred narrative was being read aloud by a tired librarian. The monks of the riverbank, hearing the murmurs, smiled faintly, recognizing the absurdity of seeking permanence in a world that was undeniably shifting. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the artisans settled on low stools, sharing cracked figs and warm flatbread, while the night breeze brushed against their sandaled feet. Their conversation drifted from the stubbornness of limestone to the playful banter about the strange hats worn by the foreign traders, a gentle humor that softened the day's weariness. The priests, after the council, walked slowly along the colonnade, their sandals ticking softly on the stone, and paused to listen to the distant chant of workers laying new bricks for a road expansion. In that quiet interlude, the temple's grand halls echoed less with formal liturgy, and more with the rhythmic pulse of everyday life, hammer on mortar, the sigh of water from the Nile, and the occasional laugh of a child chasing a stray cat. The ceremony's grandiosity receded, leaving a serene tableau of humans simply existing within the ancient walls. Years later, when the last of the original Opit banners had faded to a muted ochre, the memory of the festival lingered like a soft afterglow in the minds of the older craftsmen. They would sit by the riverbank, the water cool against their palms, and recall the faint scent of incense that once rose higher than the temple pylons, now mingled with the earthy aroma of fresh mud from newly dug canals. The priests, their faces still hidden in shadowed reliefs, would reflect on how the rites had become a quiet backdrop to the kingdom's expanding horizons, a gentle reminder that even sacred traditions are subject to the slow erosion of time. In the hush of twilight, the repaired statues stood, their cracks now filled, and their gazes turned toward a horizon that held both ancient dunes and the smokestacks of distant workshops. Thus, the end of the grand ceremonies was not a sudden rupture, but a measured settling, like sand slipping gently through the fingers of a weathered hand. The Opet festival begins under a pale dawn, the gilded bark gliding along the Nile, while the city watches from stone walls. Vendors shuffle figs and incense, their hands steady despite the cool mist that brushes the water. Musicians tap soft rhythms on tambourines, the sound carrying like a low tide. The high priest, his face hidden in the hooded veil of morning light, climbs the prow and steadies the sail. Observers feel a quiet anticipation, as if the river itself were holding its breath. Midway, heavy clouds gather, and rain drummed against the bark's wooden hull, turning the smooth glide into a reluctant push. The wind tugged the canvas, causing the crew to scramble, their muscles tightening against the sway. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the temple of Luxor's towering pylons, where the inner sanctum shivered under the storm's weight. Without warning, a section of the marble ceiling gave way, dust trembling down and muffling the chant that rose from the courtyard. The sudden collapse silenced the voices, leaving only the hiss of water and the tremor of terrified feet. The high priest paused, his shadow falling across the fallen stones, his eyes unseen behind a veil of dust and darkness. He had expected the ceremony to climax with divine music, yet now the only echo was the hollow drip of water from broken columns. The priests in linen robes exchanged glances, their lips parting to speak, but the syllables dying in the stale air. It was ironic that the very structure meant to protect the sacred could become its own undoing with a careless crack. Even the crowd, accustomed to grand processions, stood still, the spectacle reduced to a quiet inconvenience. Accepting the impossibility of reconstruction that night, the high priest lowered a small jar of oil onto the altar, the liquid glimmering dull against the cracked stone. He whispered a simple offering, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble, while his face remained hidden by the shaft of torchlight. The remaining participants placed their hands on the cool stone, feeling the rough texture as a reminder of mortality. A gentle breeze slipped through the breach, cooling the heated skin of onlookers and carrying away the scent of wet limestone. In that unadorned moment, the ceremony folded into a quiet ritual of acceptance. As the storm faded, the bark was guided back to the dock, its sails furled like tired wings, and the city's rhythm returned to everyday commerce. The Oppet Festival, once a yearly assurance of renewal, lingered only in the memory of those who had witnessed its abrupt end. Scholars would later note the silence as a turning point, a reminder that even the grandest traditions hinge on fragile walls. Children playing near the temple's shadow would someday hear the story and smile at the idea of a priest offering tea to a forgotten god. In the long stretch of history, this modest cessation became a soft footnote, proof that human hope endures beyond the collapse of stone. In the heat of the late summer, the banks of the Nile thrummed with the Oppet procession, a ribbon of gilded barges slipping past sun-warmed stone. Musicians lifted reed flutes, while the scent of incense curled around the shoulders of priests, whose faces remained hidden beneath heavy linen shadows. Merchants set up stalls of fragrant herbs, their hands brushing the cool sand as visitors pressed forward to glimpse the sanctified bark. Children, eyes wide with curiosity, chased the echo of drums that rolled like distant thunder across the quay. The whole scene glowed with a steady, warm light, as if the very air were a slow, patient breath of the city itself. When the last pharaoh's name faded from the temple walls, the crowds thinned and the river's current seemed to carry a sigh. The once loud cymbals grew muffled, their metallic clangs now echoing only in empty courtyards, while the stone steps grew slick with the occasional drizzle of desert rain. Officials who once coordinated the rites slipped into quieter offices, their gestures less grand, their parchment stamps trembling with the weight of an era waning. Even the priests, still cloaked in anonymity, moved with slower steps, their robes brushing the cool stone as the festival's rhythm faltered. A subtle tension lingered, a quiet awareness that something cherished was slipping between the fingers of time. Centuries later, a caravan of travelers arrived, their backpacks rustling louder than any ancient drum, eyes scanning the ruins through lenses that captured pixels rather than prayers. They arranged portable stools on the worn stones, sipping sweet dates while the wind whispered through the columns. An ironic chorus of modern convenience against the backdrop of faded hieroglyphs, their laughter soft but unmistakable, blended with the distant call of a nightjar, creating a tableau where reverence and casual conversation shared the same breath. A lone guide, his face obscured by the brim of a dusty hat, pointed out the remnants of the bark, his finger tracing lines that once guided a king's journey. The scene unfolded with a gentle humor, as if the ancient ceremony were now a quiet anecdote told over tea. As twilight settled, a small group of locals gathered near the altar, their hands moving in a rhythm that echoed the old chants without words. Candlelight flickered against the beige walls, casting elongated shadows that danced like tired memories across the floor. The soft murmur of a single reed flute rose, its tone warm and unhurried, while a child rested a hand on the cool limestone, feeling the faint pulse of centuries beneath. The air held a mellow temperature, neither biting nor heavy, inviting a calm that settled like dust after a gust. In this measured stillness, the remnants of the opposite rite seemed to breathe anew, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet acknowledgement of continuity. Scholars, seated by the river's edge, later recorded their observations in faded notebooks, noting how the grand festival had transformed into whispered tradition. Their pens traced the line where history softened into memory, each entry a gentle reminder of human imperfection and the endurance of ritual. They described the stone's texture, the lingering scent of dried figs, and the faint echo of distant drums that survived only in imagination. The conclusion was not one of loss, but of a subtle acceptance that ceremonies, like rivers, change course, yet retain a familiar current. In the quiet that followed, the narrative settled like a slow tide, carrying with it a calm, reflective appreciation for the way the past lingers in ordinary moments.